mental health can be a difficult topic to talk about. I'd like to change that. I'm Marcus Pibworth, and welcome to the Ministry of Change podcast. Hello, welcome to the Ministry of Change podcast. Welcome back if you've been before, and welcome for the first time if this is your first time. I hope the start of your year is going well. Once again, I'm recording this intro from the French Alps, although the conversation I'm going to play today was actually recorded in London just before Christmas. I am in the French Alps for the next few months, spending some time in the mountains, which is nice. And I've just finished being a participant and helping out a bit with a mindful skiing retreat, which has been really nice. We got a lot of chance to go out in the mountains and ski and do some snowshoeing, and also had some qigong sessions and some sessions with a sort of Chinese medicine and martial arts practitioner, Ben, who he led us through various processes to help us sort of ground ourselves, but also help us connect with the various parts of our body which would be used when skiing and out in walking in the mountains. So that was really nice. It was a nice, relaxing chance to be with people, be outside, and learn some new things. I do really like those sort of things like qigong. I remember, if you listen to one of the earlier podcasts with Max St. John, where I went down to Cornwall and did some qigong with him. It's something I really like, and at some point I'd like to build it into a more regular practice. What else has been happening? Oh, last night I got hold of a copy of Positive News magazine. If you listened to the last episode, you'll know I interviewed that was an interview with Lucy Purdy, the editor of Positive News magazine, which was a great interview. And also this issue of Positive News magazine features me talking about Ministry of Change, and so that's really exciting. And yesterday I got my hands on a hard copy. It's not easy to pick up in France, so a friend came out and he brought me a copy, so that was really nice. If you haven't yet got a copy of Positive News this quarter, then do go out and get it, and you'll see my face on it and lots of other lovely people and amazing things. Anyway, so this episode of the podcast, I went and met up with a guy called James Arnoldi. He's really great. I met him a couple of months ago on a mutual friend of ours, canal boat. Our friend lives on a canal boat, and we were both visiting at the same time, and we got chatting, and it was really interesting to talk to him. And then he invited me to go and stay with him in London a few weekends later, and I went there, and we had this really good conversation. It's really interesting. James talks about this sort of, he terms it either spiritual awakening or psychotic episode, or both, where for a period he believed he was Jesus, and it's really, really fascinating to talk to him about that and the process of sort of re-grounding and re-becoming human. And while it's there, James also put on this amazing event at he's part of this non-religious church called New Unity in London, and it's really fascinating. He invited me along there, so I went on the Sunday morning to that congregation, which was really interesting. And then the night before, he put on this event called This Is Your Heart, and it was a sort of open mic event, but people were encouraged to bring along sort of poems, spoken word, performance, that sort of thing, and really encouraged to do something maybe for the first time, something they hadn't done before. And so the whole evening was amazing. There were so many people sharing stuff, and most people were doing something that they hadn't done before. I got up and I shared a poem, and it was the first time I'd really stood up in front of a group of people and shared a poem, and it was really it was sort of empowering and really exciting to do. And it's just such a vulnerable space with so many people sharing amazing things, and I loved it so much, and I really wish there was more stuff like that in the world. And I think there is more and more stuff like that in the world, and that's a really positive thing. So anyway, in a minute I'll get on to just share the conversation that James and I had at his house in sort of mid to late December 2018. And just before that, I would ask you, if you do like these podcasts, then please do rate and review them. That does really help me. And also, if you can offer any support, I have a Patreon page, and that's how I'm trying to fund this project to help me continue to create spaces to talk about mental health and navigating life and what it means to be human. So please do go on there, and if you have anything that you can offer, then that is great. And you get access to extra things like sort of transcripts, extra episodes, bonus features, that sort of thing. And I'm gradually building up that Patreon. So that is wonderful, and that's how I continue to do this. But if you're unable to do that, then that is totally fine, and just listen. That's really good. But if you can, then just think of it as enabling those people that can't afford to contribute financially to continue to listen. That, but really, listen, like, share. That's the most important thing. Anyway, for now, I am going to hand you over to myself and James to talk about what we talk about.
So my name is James Arnoldi, and I'm a counsellor for children. So I've been in that role for actually only for 2.5 years. Originally, I trained as a primary school teacher, and I live in North London. And my life changed, at least from the interior, in a big way about 4 years ago, when I had what I felt was a spiritual awakening. What I now still consider to be a spiritual awakening, but also a psychotic experience. And that's where I really got into the whole agenda of mental health, but from a very personal perspective, and then later in my training to become a therapist for kids. So that's why I was interested in talking to you about mental health and having a conversation about that, because it is part of my everyday life, and it's an ongoing part of my growth, really, engaging with how I am mentally, how my well-being, my mental well-being, and how I do or do not help people in my world to be healthy in their own psychological makeup. And so I'm very interested by that.
So what can you tell me more about what you mean by the spiritual awakening / psychotic episode?
So I 4 years ago, I was just coming back from Japan after trying to go and find myself, and not really finding myself. I felt that it would be, with my Japanese heritage, my mother being Japanese, I felt like it was really important for me to spend some time out there. Did a Buddhist pilgrimage, worked on a biodynamic farm in northern Japan, spent some time just in the outskirts of Tokyo with family friends, learning Japanese, and all of that kind of left me feeling relatively numb, which surprised me because I'd spent so much time travelling and found it incredibly enthralling and fulfilling. But I think I'd got to a threshold point where the real issues were inside, and there's no matter of no amount of travelling that could really help me, except for highlighting the facts that I needed to address internal things. And so my housemate at the time, still my housemate actually, he emailed me and said, "James, you've got to come on this family constellation retreat in near Glastonbury this summer." It was about a month away, and I just spent £800 whilst I was sitting in the shadow of a temple on my Buddhist pilgrimage, and just was very impulsively thinking I need to do this. And went to the family constellation retreat a month later when I come back from Japan. And being the cynical person that I am, maybe less so now, but certainly then, I kind of approached it with a scathing cynicism, despite the fact that I was actually quite unhappy and depressed.
So what is family constellations? Can you tell a bit more about that?
It's a form of group therapy which is founded on the, I guess you'd say, belief that a lot of trauma is transgenerational, and that even when you have trauma that you experience within your own life, that in some ways it can be transgenerational, because you might be repeating patterns that your ancestors had in their own life. So, for example, on the extreme level of things, if you have multiple cases of, this is all theoretical obviously, but if you had multiple cases of sexual abuse in the family, even if it wasn't your direct relative, so even if it wasn't like a father or mother or uncle or aunt, if it went back several generations, it could still have kind of an echo effect in your own life. And I think people would agree that obviously this can be true to some extent, but I think a lot of people, once you actually get into a family constellation therapy workshop, it becomes much more esoteric, I guess, and potentially uncomfortable for some people, because it's quite it's a bit more of there's a mystical element to it, at least with the practitioner that I work with. So you're in a group setting. You on a very practical level, you choose members of the group who you typically don't know to represent your nuclear family, whether they're alive or dead. Even if you're adopted and you don't know your parents, you'd still select two people to represent your parents, even if you don't know their names. In my case, I have a brother and mother and father, all of them currently alive, and so I would select 3 people to represent them. You tell each person their kind of life story, but only any significant separations or trauma that they've experienced in their life. Not about like, you never loved me, that kind of thing, but just very much like, this is what happened to you at the age of 3, this is what happened to you at the age of 15, and that's it. And by extension, you tell them the story of any trauma that happened with their ancestors, so fathers or mothers or grandparents coming off of them. And then you place them in the space. So you have a room that you're working in. You place them in the space in a way that kind of metaphorically represents your relationship. And then the therapist guides you through a process of introducing any other ancestors who might be relevant, in inverted commas, to the trauma that you might be dealing with. In my case, I just had a generalised depression, so I was kind of like, in fact, I was completely in denial. So I said, well, I don't have problems. I'm just doing this because I'm curious, and Hugh's told me about this cool thing. And so I came at it from a place of like believing that I had no issues, and despite the fact that I'd actually been quite depressed for a significant amount of time. And then everything unravelled within that space over the course of 7 days. And interestingly, when I was working on my own family, nothing happened, and I kind of laughed it off as something that was just proved that I had no issues. But when I started being chosen to be aborted children or uncles or rapists in other people's families, suddenly I found myself like overwhelmed by these emotions that were completely unfamiliar to me, mainly because I spent most of my life kind of suppressing my emotions. And in the course of one person's particular family constellation, I had a massive breakdown, and which at the time I experienced as a kind of unleashing of pain and suffering within my body that I'd never experienced before, and that I guess from a spiritual side at the time I was thinking, this is like a kind of enlightenment process, because I felt like it allowed me to connect to like the suffering of all beings. And so I kind of walked around for the next kind of month and a half, 2 months on cloud 9, just feeling like I could connect to all of existence. I was extremely ungrounded. And in some ways I think I guess I'm just left with a sense of I don't know what really happened to me. Things have been pieced together in the 4 years since that event happening, but I'm left with a sense of awe at my experience, and I'm very happy to call it a psychotic experience, but I wouldn't want to box it within that as not being anything else. And similarly, I think calling it a spiritual awakening, I also relate to it as that, because I think it's allowed me to connect to people in a way that I wasn't able to connect to before. But similarly, I wouldn't even necessarily want to just call it that.
So what happens after those 2 months of walking around on cloud 9?
I mean, so practically speaking, because I'd just come back from Japan, I had the issue of like having to find a job and work. So I was working. I found a job working in a school whilst I was doing teacher training, and I found it incredibly depressing because I was working with what I saw as like angelic beings, these little kind of year one kids who were just in their own state of awe and wonder at the world, and I was having to kind of fulfill their math target requirements and that kind of thing in class, and it was so at odds with my experience of the world in the previous couple of months. So I just really struggled. And I got very, very depressed, and I also had, I think from a mental health perspective, I think the way I see it now is that yes, my experience was revealing of a certain kind of truth, in the sense that it allowed me to get in touch with a certain reality that everyone suffers in some way, or if they don't suffer, that they're kind of, maybe it's a delayed suffering that will come at some point. But because of my background, firstly maybe of being a millennial and being maybe it's told I know it's a stereotype for our generation, but being told like, you're going to go and conquer the world, you're going to do great things. I know not everyone gets told that, but certainly around my friendship group, that's a typical thing, and it kind of leads to a sense of entitlement.
I think even if you don't get told that directly, I think that's sort of the message that we're sort of given around us. That's what we need to do.
Right, exactly. And I think because that was the message that I received in one way or another, my experience was not enough to just be what it was. It kind of became a new form of narrative for me, whereby, oh, I've experienced this incredible spiritual thing that happened to me, and therefore that makes me the Messiah, or that makes me whatever. I mean, I literally thought that I was like a kind of a born again Jesus. Not that I would necessarily say that to people, but I definitely had massive bouts of grandiosity coupled with bouts of severe depression, where I just didn't want to live because it was just too painful to actually touch that reality of, oh, maybe I'm not Jesus or Krishna or whatever it was I thought I was at the time. Maybe I'm just a normal human being who's just experienced something that is very difficult to understand. And so that led me for about 2 years on this kind of up and downs of desperately trying to grapple onto a sense of self-worth through being a good, enlightened being. And yeah, it was only through a really wonderful relationship with my ex-girlfriend that I kind of came out of that. Effectively going into a relationship where I could prop up my sense of being divine in some way, and then both of us and my girlfriend kind of believing in that in some way, and then us kind of crashing out of that together, and me just having that moment of being like looking around and being like, oh, I'm not whether or not I have a belief system that makes me think that all humans have some kind of intrinsic divinity, like actually I do not have to be this special one, which I think maybe that was the kind of message I'd received throughout my years growing up, from whether it's from society or closer to home.
So what was that process like of changing your perception of being a Messiah to being being in what's that transition into that other state of being?
It was extremely rough. It was like one of the most painful experiences of my life, because my identity was tied. I mean, before the psychotic experience, my identity was already tied to being a good, responsible elder brother. That's just the way and that wasn't even necessarily my parents. I think that was just, it was just this sense of, you've got to be there for others. You've got to make sure you're there, empathic, listening to others, like meeting the needs of others. That was just the way I grew up, and so the Jesus narrative tied in perfectly with that. Just this kind of all-loving being who's just wandering around through the world, kind of standing up for people and spouting truths which inspire people and that kind of thing. And that reality was constantly challenged by the fact that I could barely hold down a job, and everything that was allowing me to exist in the world was just really rocky. And similarly in my relationship at the time, I put my girlfriend at the time through hell. Just, I was very...
Yeah, I can imagine it must be demanding going out with Jesus.
Exactly. Like Jesus isn't allowed to be jealous. Jesus isn't allowed to have like petty squabbles. So you just end up... I can only imagine that if you're in a relationship with wannabe, or not even wannabe Jesus, because I knew I was Jesus in a sense. That's where the psychosis comes in, right? I knew I was this ethereal being. That when you're in a relationship with someone like that, there's very little room for vulnerability, which is the kind of the crux of where I'm at now, which is much more like, I need to just admit when I just have no clue about what's going on.
So do you, like, with your experience, have you, I imagine you must maybe have looked into it or something, is this like a relatively common thing? I mean, because I'm just thinking that I know from my own experiences when I've been through something quite sort of I guess like something similar, like this, it's like unraveling moments where you feel immense pain and suffering. It's so easy to experience that as no one else has ever done this before, therefore start reading the things that you need to read into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how easy it is, because I've heard a few cases of people.
Yeah, my sense is, since finding myself in a much more stable place where I think I'm probably more connected to reality than before, to some extent. I've come across a number of cases. I mean, I know people who are going through or have been through similar things, and it's interesting that a lot of them are kind of 30-something males. I find that really interesting. I find amongst I don't think in our society women are brought up with quite the same level of adoration. I think there's something about post-war mothers. This is such a generalisation, but my sense is that males can often be idolised quite a lot by mothers, and that leads to a sense of grandiosity, whereas maybe that isn't so much the case with women.
Well, I feel like myself growing up, I remember feeling very much like I was very special, but no one else realised it. I felt, I definitely at points in my late teens and definitely 20s, and a lot of it coinciding with when I felt really depressed, were those feelings that I know that my value is so much more than anyone else realises it.
Yeah.
And I guess there was an element of this sort of, superiority complex, inferiority complex thing going on, which I now, through a lot of hard work and a lot of exploration and a lot of just sort of going out into the world and exploring, have just been able to sort of pass through and see a similar thing to you. I see a certain amount of, there's goodness and I guess divinity in all the people.
Yeah.
But when you first realise that yourself,
right.
It can
And it's interesting how that, I think in my case, my ego just latched onto it. So maybe the experience of divinity is potentially one of truth. Let's say if I'm just going to be spiritually or societally optimistic and just say everyone, it has a divine core to them, and then the trauma gets in the way of you doing kind of divine things. That may be a truth of sorts, but then my ego in particular wants to be really special because it knows it's special. So how can I make this about me? How can I make this divinity about the fact that I'm just that little bit more enlightened than everyone else and I've got something to teach the world, And I think is a kind of narcissism that I see a lot in just my relationships with people. And it's two sides of a coin, right? You have the side of the coin that I came from, which is I'm desperately clinging on to my entitled sense of I'm really special and I have something to say, and then the other side of the coin being I'm a piece of shit, I'm not worth anything, and in a way it's just another form of narcissism whereby it's about us. or it's about me, and it's about how I'm crap, or it's about how I'm great. And when you actually stand back from it a bit, it's just like, well, we're all just like we're all just these beings like going through life, and with a very, because of our senses and our society, we have this sense of I'm really at the center of my own world, and that can lead to some really severe issues with mental well-being. Certainly for me anyway. I mean, I consider myself damn lucky that I had the resources to go to therapy, to, you know, have people who love me and cherish me and were patient enough to actually tolerate my grandiosity and delusion, and who kind of helped me get through it. But loads of people don't have those resources, and they kill themselves, or they just become very, very unwell, and they don't have the resources to get out of that unwellness, so they just live in a state of depleted capacity to thrive, and they don't thrive. They kind of survive or get by, and it's saddening for me. I feel really sad to see that. Yeah.
If you go back to that, so the family constellation stuff you did, like I thought when you were talking about it, I felt it had in your voice like a degree of skepticism around it. But then, would you say, despite the consequences of what did happen, there was something there which needed to be unlocked in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And I still do it.
Yeah.
It's 4 years later, I still go to... I now only go once a year instead of like... my kind of... After my initial experience, I went 6 times in a year. I was just addicted to any sense of transcendence. I was like, I need to transcend this horrible, messed up world I live in, and I would be doing that. Now I go once a year, and it's wonderful. It's amazing. And it doesn't matter so much to me. I'm not such a rationalist anymore, so it doesn't matter so much to me whether it is the truth or whether it is real or not. I think at the very worst, it gives people really helpful metaphors and myths to feel okay about living in the world. So in the case of my family constellation therapy, I feel so connected to my Japanese, Irish, Italian ancestry. Whether or not I'm really connected, I'm actually not really that concerned about it, because I just get up in the morning, and more times than less I feel less like killing myself, which is kind of cool. I think that's kind of a cool thing to enable people to like, and I think we're so like rationally focused that we say, well, no, we have to, this has to be connected to reason. And I'm becoming, to be honest, I've become more and more cynical of that sense of, it's not that I'm against CBT or anything like that. I think it's great, and I think it functions very well for people, but I think it works within a framework where we have to be functioning, high functioning individuals and productive, and sometimes just having helpful metaphors is really important. I think it's why religion has been so important throughout human history, because whether or not a religion is right or wrong, it helps people to get up in the morning, to have a sense of worth,
I guess
have
it
a sense of connection.
Yeah, some sort of framework to structure life around, which
Exactly.
I guess sometimes we've lost a bit these days. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think we talked a lot before. We met before, obviously, and before we did this, around our own sort of, I don't know if you call it like a spiritual journey, but that and my own perspective was very much the growing up from my early teens to my late 20s of being this very militant atheist and very much believing in the world, that it had to be provable and it had to be basically visible for me to really give it any of my time, and I would just think anyone else that thought anything different was ridiculous. And then over the last years, that has changed to a point where I don't want to live in such a closed off mindset, a closed off world, and I don't believe that I have all the answers by any means. If anything, I think I might have no answers. But that to me is a much more beautiful and magical world to exist in, a world where you don't need certainties, but you can just see which bits are useful, which bits help, and and be like that it doesn't necessarily need to be, you don't need to rationally explain something that can help if it helps something. I see a lot of people doing stuff which I've done and it doesn't really do anything, but if it does for them, then it's great. And I'm sure I do loads of weird things which people just think, why is he doing that?
Yeah.
And you can easily, if you get into a rational debate about it, people can easily crush a lot of my ideas through science and facts, but I know that experientially it works for me, so that's enough.
Exactly, right? So it works for you experientially. And I think if we're not evangelizing our truth and saying, well, I do family constellation therapy, it works for me, so when are you going to sign up? Because until you sign up, I just can't look at you. As long as I'm not doing that, and the actions that, my actions in the world are benign on others, then why not? I think also it's interesting using the word magic, because that for me comes up all the time nowadays, in a very uncynical way. I feel that more than ever, I turned 30 in April, and I really felt like that was a turning point for me, whereby I feel more like a child than I've ever been, because I feel like I have a curiosity and a desire for awe and wonder and magic more than ever, apart from maybe when I was actually a child. But that makes me be more adult, because I think the way I define an adult is someone who takes responsibility for being a caring, benign presence in the world. And if I'm truly cynical, and if I do not believe in magic, or whatever you want to call it, if I do not believe that I may be wrong, or that I may have just not understood all the answers, then that makes me open to others. And I think that's that's what I define as an adult, a mature adult, is someone who can connect to the reality that they might not know everything. And I think we can often define adulthood more as, well, you find your truth, you find the truth, you find your path, and you're kind of on it, and you fixate yourself around that and accumulate all the knowledge you can, so you can do whatever you do, and then that's it. That's being an adult. But I find actually having this sense of awe and wonder and magic, or whatever it might be defined to be, is actually, there's this paradox of it being childlike, but with the adult qualities of taking responsibility if you're in crap.
Well, that's really interesting. I think I've talked quite a lot with people recently about this idea of innate wisdom, and people having access to innate wisdom but not really always knowing that. And so, for example, I guess in the last few years I've realised much more clearly that I can meet a 17-year-old that just seems to have a much deeper understanding of the world than I do, and equally I can meet a 70-year-old who just seems to not have any wisdom at all.
Yeah.
And I realise that it's not that it's nothing to do with age. It's about how soon you can stop and listen and access that innate wisdom. And I think I just find that really interesting.
It's something that came up a lot in my art therapy training, when I was training to be a child therapist. This notion of, because I think we often think of therapy, the stereotype of maybe a psychoanalyst might be that you lie down on the couch, you tell me about your dreams, and then I'll tell you what that means about your mum, or your relationship with your mum, or whatever it is. Which is a stereotype, and I know that most psychoanalysts don't do that at all. But it's there for a reason, because that's the kind of heritage that we have with regards to old school therapy. But in my art therapy training, you've got kids creating these images, and they're not trying to create anything beautiful. They're just smearing paint on the paper because they're really angry with whatever's just happened, or they're just creating these flowing colours because they're just feeling really sad, or whatever's coming up. And I find it really interesting, the concept within art therapy that says that within the image, that is effectively an image of your inner world, there is wisdom that you can help the child access through simple questions. And like you're saying, simple listening and questioning, and that you're not, imposing your theories upon the child. You're just getting the child to communicate what they're feeling through paint or through sculpture or whatever it is, and then helping them access insight that's already in them, that's already there. It's innate, like you're saying, it's innate wisdom. And actually, because children tend to be slightly less conditioned than us, they can often access that with more ease than...
Yeah, that's sort of what I was leaning to, is that idea that I've talked to a couple of people on the podcast before around this, and it's that idea of getting, like the older you get, the more your surroundings can start to influence you, and they can seem like an object reality, that you get more deeply involved in your sort of the beliefs of your social circles, the bubble, the sort of advertisements, the government, your family circles, and you start to have less ability to access that wisdom because the whole world around you is starting to tell you that things are a certain way. And I think children have a much more free ability to access a different world to that. And so I think a lot of the times why I find, like, when through my own experience of depression and speaking to a lot of other people about their sort of mental health experiences and awakenings of certain things, it's those people that have had to basically look at the world and think, well, the world that I'm inhabiting in my head is fucked up, and it's a reflection of my sort of perception of the external world, so now maybe I need to do something and start being less dogmatic about my understanding of how the world works, and going out and exploring and listening to other people's ideas of how the world works. I mean, that's definitely my personal experience, but I think one that I've heard quite a lot from other people.
There's something that just feels to me as incredibly stultifying and dead about just knowing the truth, or just having that concept in your mind, that feeling of knowing. For me, when I was, and I say when I was Jesus, not when I believed I was Jesus, because belief suggests that there might be some room for doubt. I knew I was some kind of incarnation of Jesus. My life was so rigid. Like, I had to operate within a very strict framework. My relationship with, I mean, I don't know if you know much about how Jesus has sex, but like, it's highly performative.
I know nothing about how Jesus has sex.
It turns out that someone who knows their Jesus and who's also been brought up as a man in 21st century Western society, at least in my case, was just like obsessed with performance. So I'm a good spiritual whole person, so I have to be utterly giving to my lover, and I have to make sure that, like, her coming is the only objective, for example, and which by the way, I've got nothing against, obviously giving pleasure to your partner. I think that's an amazing thing. But when it's so kind of rigidly codified within your sense of being, it just means that you become a kind of performative machine. I mean, I found myself to become a performative machine. I have a tendency to generalize, by the way, so you can like kind of call me out on that, because I sometimes just say, what Jesus does. But I'm saying that in jest in a way, but really it was from my personal experience of knowing I was a divine being. There was no room for my own pleasure, actually. And I remember one of my best female friends showing me a very feminist TED talk by a woman who advocates pleasure in women and says, like, you women, you've just always been so fixated, for good reason, because of society and conditioning, you've been fixated on pleasuring your partner and you've never thought about your own pleasure. When I watched that video, I felt like she was talking to me. I started crying when I was watching it, because I just realised how fixated I'd been on being a good, pleasure-giving, loving being who has no imperfections. And like, the most releasing thing at that time was, a year after my initial psychotic experience, crashing out of that paradigm with my girlfriend at the time, and just realising, like, being able to breathe for the first time and saying, oh wow, I'm completely imperfect, and it's amazing, and there's a relief, like a weight off my shoulders, this kind of narcissistic trait of like feeling that I was the embodiment of salvation for everyone around me, It's just incredibly pressurizing place to be in. You know?
It sounds exhausting, yeah.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'm quite interested actually, because I mean, this is just forming in my mind, so I'm not sure how it's going to come out. But like I guess I spend a lot of time talking to people about what it means to be human and how we can become more human. And to me, it sounds like maybe it's coming from like, I often approaching it from people that like sort of don't realize their own humanity from a completely different way, and it's like sort of learning to move into your body and into your experiences and into the world around you and to your internal life and external life. This one seems, I'm not sure how to put it, but like it's learning to become human from the other extreme of being like, I'm above humanity and now I need to learn to what it means to become human again.
It's like the negative of like a negative image in a photograph or something.
Or maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's just an extreme of the same thing.
Yeah.
But but it sounds very much this sort of like journey of becoming human within that.
Right. And when part of my healing process from that kind of episode and that time was finding a spiritual community that I could actually resonate with, and ideologically and emotionally, and it was a non-religious church in northeast London, which I still go to, and when I gave my first sermon there, which the minister very kindly invited me to do, it was about this psychotic experience and this experience of knowing I was Jesus. But the title of it was Growing into the Unknown, this sense of awe and magic and wonder that you talk about, and that incredibly growthful place one can be in when we let go of knowing everything, or needing to know everything, or thinking that we know everything, in my case. And that's definitely something that I advocate for in my work that I do with kids and adults, is trying to become more comfortable with not having all the answers and not knowing, and therefore being open to connection and community and the things that we're so ready to maybe subconsciously reject, because we're independent human beings who've found the truth and we know how to like live our own separate lives.
I was going to say, I mean, that your experience is very, that it does seem like an extreme experience, but it does seem to bear quite a lot of resemblance to how I feel like a lot of people do live their lives, thinking that they found the answer.
For sure.
Maybe they're not proclaiming to be Jesus, but they're proclaiming to have the answers to life, which is
absolutely. I don't think that actually my experience I think my experience may have been extreme in its form, but I don't think it's original in any sense of the word. I think a lot of people live within a less extreme version of that. And actually, because it was so extreme, it allowed me to get out of it quicker. But I think a lot of people just live that less intensely, but on a very everyday level for years.
So that's really interesting for me about a lot of the conversations I've been having around depression, especially because that's my main area of expertise from my own life. But that's like a very similar thing is that actually the more people I talk to that wouldn't even describe themselves as having sort of depression, I feel like a lot of people put up with life. They put up with a low level of misery and suffering enough, and it's often the people which go to the extremes through some experience or another that have these opportunities or gifts, or I don't know what the right terminology is, but this opportunity to actually address it and change the course of their life and move back to the path which is more in line with their being. And actually a lot of the people that don't experience those extremes, they will just never realise that there's a different option and a different way. So I think it's really powerful when people that do have those experiences can sort of share those stories to enable other people to see.
I think you really hit on an important point there, because I used earlier in the podcast, I used the word depressed to describe my state in Japan before I had this experience. I never would have said that at the time. I was numb and I was unaware of it. So for example, up until 2 years ago, I had an addiction to running. That was my go-to. So I would run 3 or 4 times a week, irrespective of whether I had knee pain, because it was just the thing I did to make myself feel okay with myself. When I was in Japan, at my most intense level of depression, well, that's what I call it now, I was running every day. And I completely was ruining my body because I wasn't preparing properly. It's not, I know a lot of people run every day, but they do a lot of kind of stretching and lots of exercises to make sure that they're keeping their body healthy. I was not doing that. I was just compulsively running every day. And I would only use the term depression to describe where I was at then, now, because I didn't have the awareness to know that there was anything else apart from this kind of dull ache.
I can identify with that for sure.
That was my adolescence, the dull ache.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that feeling of not understanding that's not how life needs to be is something that it took me, probably from about the age of 15 to 27 or something to realise. And when I look back, I can easily retroactively be like, I was fucking depressed a lot of the time. I mean, I think someone that is not depressed doesn't spend probably a decade going out drinking and partying all the time and never sitting with themselves and allowing themselves to just be by themselves and to listen to their own experience. At the time, if you'd asked me, are you depressed? I'd have said, no, I'm having loads of fun. But there would have definitely been a part of me that knew that I wasn't.
So interesting. I mean, just talking about this whole going out and partying thing, because I was a good golden child, I didn't really do the whole drug drink thing, unfortunately, in a way. But what I did do, like my personality type has actually started to change since doing therapy and stuff, because I always said I'm an extrovert. I love spending time around people, being with people all the time. What I wasn't aware of was my absolute sense of desolation about being by myself on a Friday night. And nowadays I find myself sometimes going out, sometimes like reveling in just being by myself for a whole evening and doing nothing whatsoever, or just doing my tarot cards or whatever it is I like to do.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating, how we define ourselves, and then actually sometimes looking back on past periods of time, we can realise that actually they were symptomatic of something that wasn't necessarily wholly healthy. I know I justified my addiction to running with the knowing that running is good for you, and the knowing that exercise is really important for human beings. I didn't matter that I was ruining my knees. I rationalised that away, and just because I was, I don't see going running every day compulsively as any different from getting absolutely plastered on any night of the week. But within my paradigm, it was a lot better, and it was acceptable.
I guess it's a form of control over your emotional state.
Of course.
In a way. And I guess you can be addicted to anything. And I mean, arguably running every day may be better than, I don't know, like a heroin addiction, but it's still something which is I can't even speak, a symptom of something deeper going on underneath.
And the same need where one is saying, I am not okay with where I am right now, and therefore that is going to provide the solace that I need.
It's funny, the first thought never really seems to be to go on a long internal journey, does it? It's because they're painful, I know that.
Extremely painful.
They're extremely painful,
yeah.
And they're the hardest ones to do, but it seems to be ultimately they are the only way to do it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's prescriptive. Maybe for someone it's not. Maybe taking ketamine in a club is their route to enlightenment.
Yeah.
I don't know.
From my experience, I think enlightenment's kind of overrated anyway.
Yeah. Sounds like
that makes me sound like I actually was enlightened at some point, which I wasn't. But I'm also interested by this notion of depression, because I would say that I still have depressive moments currently, but I'm much more connected to either feeling joy or despair. Like, I don't think I ever felt despair when I was depressed, in a weird way. Like, I felt this kind of numbness. Nowadays, sometimes I wake up in the morning, I genuinely feel despair, and I'm like, oh, life is so painful. But I'm feeling pain, which is like kind of better somehow than feeling depressed. And then other times I'm just feeling abundant joy, or somewhere in between the two, or whatever. But it's just it feels like my blinkers are off, and I'm able to get a much wider range of experience. Which is
I think that's a really valid point, because I mean, I think there was a point where I would have defined myself through the depression, and now I no longer would, but that's not to say that it's gone. Like, I still have days and weeks where I feel quite what I would describe as depressed, and definitely days and weeks where I feel anxious. But yeah, they are much more on a spectrum of emotion now. It is that I can experience the highs and the lows and the middle points and understand them and see them for what they are, rather than sort of, I mean, it's true, not always, but a lot of the time when I was depressed, it was just this real inability to feel anything, to connect with anyone. Even like sometimes like the very act of like being touched would sort of repulse me by people, because I just felt like I'm just upset that I can't access emotions, like they've gone. And just that ability to be able to feel anything is important, I think. And it's easy to lose sight of those things.
So I'm really happy to say that I've started skateboarding. And that's something that my previous Jesus self would never have done, because I'm really bad at it. And it's also, it doesn't really help people in any way, and it's not really serving others. And I think this is one of the first times in my life where I've done something where it's just because it's sheer pleasure. And also I'm really bad at it, so I have this sense of like being reduced to nothingness when I'm at like Finsbury Park skate park, and I've got all these kids, like 12-year-olds, who are just amazing at skating. And I'm just there trying to go down a tiny slope and then stacking it. And I want more of that in my life, and I'd really want more of that in the lives of the people I come into contact with, because I just think it's such a refreshing thing to be able to do something for pleasure, which is benign to others, but which is really just to enjoy your life, and that you don't always have to be, I'm not advocating people not helping each other at all, but just that for someone who might resonate with the way I've lived my life in the past, that it's just great to be able to do something and not take yourself too seriously, and just be like, this is really fun, this is great, and it's okay that I'm doing it because I'm not harming others. And so I'm hoping to get more of that into my life, more skateboarding and more tarot for myself as well as for others. And that's really where I'm at.
Well, thank you very much to James for sharing that. It's really interesting. I think it's really important to hear stories like that and hear just all the different stories that are contained within us. Like, it's easy to walk down the street and just think that everyone is having the same experience as you, or think that your experience is so wildly different from anyone else's experience. Everyone else is sort of living like quotation normal lives and you're not. And so it's really important to, I think, hear all the multifaceted things which happen to us and all the different experiences we have. And I think that's really powerful. It's really opened up a whole world of possibilities. So I think just anyone that's able to be at that place where they can share their story and really be vulnerable, I think that's a powerful, powerful thing that we can do to create this sort of understanding that there is no normal, there's no one way we need to be, and there's no one human experience that is the right experience or that we all necessarily share, but it's in that diversity and in that difference that we can find those common grounds. And I just really, really believe in the power of sharing these stories and listening to how people navigate them. Again, there's not one route to navigate these things. Change comes into our lives when we least expect it, and it's not a question of avoiding change and trying to keep things as they are. It's a question of how do we navigate those things, and it's an important investigation to sort of continue to explore those ideas of how to navigate the changes that occur. And so anyway, thank you very much to James. If you are in London, go and check out the New Unity non-religious church we talked about in there briefly in East London. It's really, really interesting place. It's a lovely community, and I felt really privileged and honoured to be invited along there, and I'll definitely try and make it back there again. And yeah, I loved that. So again, thank you very much for tuning in, and yeah, please do like and share. Again, please, if you're able to support my Patreon, then that is wonderful. And for all those people that are already, thank you so much. It might not be a lot, but it really, really helps me to do this. And yeah, that's great. So yeah, thank you once again. I try not to be too pushy about that sort of support, but like, it does help me. I don't make any money apart from that with Ministry of Change at the moment. So I'm trying to get to a point where this can be self-sustaining, and that's with your help. So thank you very much. And please do like, share, go back and listen to some of the other amazing episodes we had last year. And I look forward to sharing more over the coming year, and for you to come along on the journey as Ministry of Change evolves and develops and reaches new places. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon. Goodbye.